Ever heard of the vipers that killed the survivors of Lake Okeechobee, the sisters that tied themselves to 93 orphans in Galveston, or the shipwreck that drove 2 men to madness and cannibalism after the San Ciriaco Hurricane? This video isn't just about the facts and figures behind America's deadliest hurricanes. It's about the human stories that emerged from the eye of the storm, the survivors who defied the odds, the poor decisions that killed thousands, and the communities that banded together in the wake of destruction. Join us for a terrifying journey through time, and we'll unravel the shocking stories behind the bloodiest hurricanes ever to hit the U.S. Cheniere Caminada. Cheniere Caminada was a small fishing community of around 1,500 people. It was built on a 2 to 4 foot high sandbar off the coast of Louisiana and was cut off from the mainland by impassable marshes. Being in the Gulf of Mexico, they were used to hurricanes but had never taken a direct hit. Usually, the community relied on fishermen to predict the big storms, but the hurricane of 1893 was tricky. It was initially headed for Mexico, but at the last minute, a retreating cold front caught it and brought it right over Cheniere Caminada. Late in the afternoon on October 1st, residents received their first warning of the impending disaster: seabirds heading into land. In response, fishermen hauled their boats up to their houses, but no one evacuated, figuring the settlement had survived tropical storms before and could withstand another. Only one man predicted the chaos that was about to hit: Gilbeau, who hosted a final banquet for his friends. At the end of the meal, he made a toast. "Gentlemen, this will be the last time we'll be together. For tonight, I will drown. There will be companions with me in death. You may think I'm crazy, but I cannot help that, for I am firmly convinced that a watery death will be mine." Tragically, his eerie prophecy came true. As night fell, the storm hit and the community was caught off guard by the sheer strength of the winds. At first, the residents could avoid the 8-foot storm surges by sheltering in their homes. But one by one, the wooden buildings were torn apart. As each fell, survivors recalled hearing terrified screams as the residents were washed away. Gilbeau and his family attempted to flee in his boat, but sadly, it overturned and he, along with his wife and children, drowned. Only his brothers survived to tell the tale of the prophetic dinner party. As the eye of the storm brought a few moments of calm, the strongest men went out in boats to ferry survivors from the weakest buildings to the sturdier ones, an effort that saved hundreds. Then, the second half of the hurricane hit harder, and by the time it was done, only 4 out of 500 homes were left standing, each filled with crowds of trembling survivors. Miraculously, the roof of one demolished house had remained intact and been carried to high ground. Under it, 62 people had managed to weather the storm unharmed. As the winds died and the sun rose, the local priest recalled watching the receding waters carry away the white-faced bodies of those killed. He described it as an endless, ghastly, horrible procession of specters. The next day, those who'd survived were faced with the horror of collecting the bodies and burying the dead. They were so focused on the task that they didn't stop to realize their fresh water was gone, their boats were destroyed, and they had no way of reaching the mainland. On the second day, they continued to work until one by one, they collapsed on the sand and waited for death. But just as they lost hope, 2 boats appeared on the horizon. They belonged to the fishermen who'd left before the storm to pick up ice from New Orleans. As quickly as they could, they melted the ice for drinking water and mixed it with seawater to help it go further. This was just enough to keep the survivors alive 24 more hours before aid arrived. With it came more help and the discovery of a young boy found on a remote stretch of beach. He'd only survived so long because he'd caught an orange that drifted past. In total, 779 people died in Cheniere Caminada alone, and roughly another 1,200 drowned in other parts of southern Louisiana, bringing the death toll to 2,000 and making it the deadliest hurricane in Louisiana history. 4. Lake Okeechobee, 1928. In September 1928, an enormous hurricane tore through the Caribbean, killing 1,200 in Guadalupe before hitting mainland USA. The hurricane made landfall in Florida as a Category 4, and while the coastline took a beating, the worst of the damage occurred inland along the shores of Lake Okeechobee. As the storm passed over, the 140-mile-an-hour gusts blew westwards across the lake and piled the water into a 6 to 10-foot high storm surge. This breached the small defensive dikes and flooded hundreds of square miles, including Okeechobee City and Belle Glade, where the water reached 6.1 meters deep. As the water rushed in, people sought shelter in their wooden houses, only for them to float off their foundations and crash into the nearby pine forest, crushing and drowning those inside. Some people climbed onto their roofs and managed to grab onto trees as their homes splintered against them. Horrifically, though, as they desperately clung to the branches, an army of water moccasins emerged from the waters. These poisonous vipers outnumbered the humans, and their deadly bites killed many. Those who couldn't cling on were ripped from their hiding places and washed up to 8 miles into the Everglades. There, they found themselves wounded, lost, and threatened by snakes and alligators. Some managed to stagger to safety, but many more never made it back. Although the odds were against them, there were still many survivors left in the settlements. Some had the foresight and bravery to board barges before the floodwaters hit. Others sought shelter in brick or concrete buildings that held firm against the onslaught. And one woman managed to stay alive by tying herself to a telegraph pole. After the storm had passed, the survivors emerged to complete devastation. The roads were washed out, there was no drinking water, and the nearest help at West Palm Beach was 42 miles away. The only doctor at the south of the lake, William J. Buck, was forced to take charge and gave the terrifying order to send the women and children out on foot. He knew they might die on the journey, but without drinking water, he believed it was their only hope. Miraculously, though, after around 7 exhausting miles carrying their children and babies, the women were recovered by the Red Cross. Back in the towns, cleanup began. Thanks to the Florida weather, the bodies had deteriorated quickly, and the stench was only made worse by the presence of fish and alligator carcasses left by the receding water. Despite prohibition, workers were given moonshine whiskey to sustain them, as it was thought that without it, they wouldn't have the strength to continue. Those who refused to work were denied food, threatened at gunpoint, and one man was shot for his refusal. Every town created its own outdoor morgue with piles of bodies. But when they grew too large, residents were forced to resort to mass graves and funeral pyres. In total, 2,823 people lost their lives that day. Horrifically, the disaster occurred in a time of segregation. So the white bodies were identified and given caskets, and it was the black bodies that were burnt, and around 75% of the victims had been black migrant laborers who were never formally identified. Finally, their bodies were laid to rest separately. The white victims went to Woodlawn Cemetery and had a memorial erected in their memory. The black victims were buried in Pauper Cemetery and largely forgotten. However, not everyone forgot, and the Storm of 28 Memorial Park Coalition Incorporated formed to fight for their recognition. Eventually, they succeeded, and a historical marker was finally added to the gravesite in 2003. Interested in discovering more about the dark shadows of history? Like, subscribe, and share. Every click helps grow our channel and brings you more incredible tales. 3. Hurricane Maria, 2017. On September 20, 2017, Hurricane Maria swept through the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico and several other Caribbean nations. At peak intensity, it was a Category 5 with wind speeds up to 175 miles an hour and a colossal 32-mile-wide eye. The wind tore the roofs from homes, storm surges flooded entire neighborhoods, and a nearly unimaginable 25 landslides occurred per square mile. Over 300,000 homes were destroyed, and the island's power grid was completely wiped out. Incredibly, only 64 people died in the initial onslaught through drowning and blunt force trauma from collapsing buildings and flying debris. But for the next 6 months, Maria would grow to claim the lives of 2,975 people in Puerto Rico alone, making it the third bloodiest hurricane ever to strike a U.S. territory. But what caused the death toll to skyrocket so dramatically? Tragically, it was entirely preventable disaster mismanagement. 83% of emergency water stocks and 90% of other emergency supplies had been used in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma that had hit 2 weeks before, and the stores hadn't been restocked. This left survivors in desperate need of food and water. Other countries were ready to help, but as a U.S. territory, the Jones Act prohibited Puerto Rico from accepting any aid from non-U.S. vessels. The restriction could have been waived, but the Department of Homeland Security refused, stating insufficient port capacity. So people went without much-needed supplies for 8 days until federal aid finally arrived. Seeing the offerings were insufficient, San Juan's mayor, Carmen Yulín Cruz, held a press conference the next day to plead with the government for faster help. "We're dying, and you're killing us with the inefficiency," she said. But instead of increasing rescue efforts, then President Trump responded by accusing her of poor leadership. Eventually, on October 2nd, Oxfam decided to step in for the first time since Katrina, calling the government's response slow and inadequate. On October 3rd, Trump visited the disaster zone but left, stating it wasn't a real catastrophe like Katrina. "What's your death count?" he quipped. 17? But while it's true that the toll was initially low, the slow response was causing deaths. They just weren't being recorded correctly. Officials could see that the morgues were overflowing, and the number of deaths that fall were 27% higher than usual. So they ordered an independent recount in 2018. The resulting report concluded that in the 6 months after the hurricane, deaths from sepsis skyrocketed up 47%, pneumonia 45%, and emphysema 43%. And they saw rises in many other conditions compared to the same period in the previous year. People had been dying slowly and quietly due to insufficient health care, lack of medicine, electricity, and clean water. In total, they concluded that 2,975 people had died as a direct result of Hurricane Maria. Trump disputed this by saying 3,000 people didn't die in the 2 hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico, and claimed that the report was only produced to make him look bad and that he loved Puerto Rico. However, Elaine Duke, then acting Secretary of Homeland Security, later alleged that in the immediate aftermath of Maria, Trump had asked, "Can we outsource the electricity? Can we sell the island, or divest of that asset?" And former DHS Chief of Staff Miles Taylor reported that Trump proposed swapping Puerto Rico for Greenland because Puerto Rico was dirty and the people were poor. Of course, we'll never know the truth of what was said behind closed doors, but thanks to an August 2023 report, it's unlikely that Maria will stay the only hurricane to be given a revised and much higher death count after 6 months. New studies have shown that heart, lung, and mental health issues are the delayed killers after tropical storms, and the true death tolls in the U.S. are likely 13 times higher than those reported. 2. The San Ciriaco Hurricane, 1899. The 1899 San Ciriaco Hurricane first appeared at a storm on August 3rd to the southwest of Cape Verde, where a nearby British steamship observed a sharp drop in air pressure and increasingly rough seas. Even in this early stage, it was unusual, as the ship captain noted that he had never seen any weather of cyclonic character so far to the eastward before. As it grew into a Category 4 hurricane, it passed through the islands of the Lesser Antilles, where it destroyed houses, sank boats, and caused hundreds of deaths. Tragically, though, it was just getting warmed up. The hurricane made landfall in Puerto Rico on August 8th, where it inflicted wind speeds of 140 miles an hour and dumped 23 inches of rain. This, combined with the storm surges, led to devastating floods. Over $17 million worth of crops were destroyed, businesses were demolished, and 3,369 people were killed, primarily by drowning. Next to suffer were the Greater Antilles and Bahamas. Hundreds more were killed, and thousands were left homeless. Small boats were also sunk, and their crews' bodies washed ashore. As the storm traveled northwards past Florida, it encountered a ship called the Drought. As the huge waves swept over the vessel, the captain and 17 men were dragged overboard. The surviving crew quickly fashioned a raft out of the ship's plank and were swept out to sea. Before long, their raft split, with 6 men on one piece and 2 on the other. Soon, tragedy would befall both halves. On the 2-person raft, one man, not wanting to suffer a drawn-out and painful death, jumped into the ocean and drowned. However, it wasn't long before the other man was successfully rescued. On the 6-person raft, 3 shortened their suffering by jumping into the ocean, and the remaining 3 drew lots to see who should be killed and cannibalized. The blood in the loser's veins sustained them for a while. But after days had passed, one of the survivors lost his mind and attacked the other, biting chunks of flesh from his face and chest. Eventually, after 2 weeks, the 2 traumatized men were rescued. In total, the San Ciriaco Hurricane lasted 27.75 days, making it the longest-lasting Atlantic hurricane in recorded history, which is how its devastation was so widespread. Tragically, Puerto Rico was by far the worst hit, suffering 3,369 deaths out of a total of 3,855. In addition, their crops had been obliterated. There were now gaping holes in their economy and food supply, and 250,000 were left without food or shelter, a brutal blow that came just 12 months after America had seized control during the Spanish-American War. Being under the control of a superpower like America should have been an advantage for the people of Puerto Rico. And sure enough, 32 million pounds of food was soon delivered, which is estimated to have saved 100,000 lives. However, the aid came with strings. U.S. Army Brigadier General George W. Davis, who had organized the deliveries, gave help only to those willing to clear the rubble and bury the dead, and landowners denied food and shelter to anyone unwilling to clear their land and recover crops. Those too injured or traumatized to work went without. 1. Great Galveston Hurricane, 1900. The city of Galveston was a boomtown. Having been founded in 1839, the population was already over 37,000 by 1900, and the citizens were among the highest paid in the U.S. The reason for the city's success was its location in Galveston Bay in the Gulf of Mexico. This made it a key trade center for Texas and a busy port. But its prime location also brought risk. The whole city was built on what was essentially a low-lying sandbar, no more than 2.7 meters above sea level, well below the storm surges that could come with a potential hurricane. Some residents were concerned and petitioned for a seawall, but Isaac Klein, the director of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, thought he knew best. He firmly believed that there was no chance of a strong storm reaching Galveston, claiming it was a simply absurd delusion to think it could. As a compromise and to calm nerves, the city cut away some of the sand dunes, which were the only natural defense against hurricanes, and used them to fill in the city's lowest-lying areas, a strategy that did more harm than good. 4 days before the hurricane hit, the warnings started rolling in. Unfortunately, though, the Weather Bureau had blocked telegraph reports from the most advanced meteorological station in Cuba due to tensions following the Spanish-American War, so no one in the U.S. had a clear idea of where it would hit. On September 8, 1900, the day of the disaster, the seas swelled, but as the weather was only partly cloudy, no one was alarmed. Realizing his mistake, Klein broke the Central Bureau's rule banning the issue of hurricane warnings without permission and sounded the alarm. He also claimed that he rode along the beach on horseback, warning people to evacuate, but there's no evidence to back this up. The first storm surge that hit the island was 4.6 meters high, flooding the entire city. The wind reached 100 miles an hour before the anemometer was blown off the Weather Bureau, and more rain fell in those 24 hours than ever before. Buildings were swept off their foundations and collapsed, or worse, they crashed into other buildings and took them down too. Thousands drowned, were hit by flying projectiles, or were crushed under the collapsing roofs. In the St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, the sisters gathered 93 children in the newest part of the building and tied themselves into groups with clotheslines. They sang Queen of the Waves as the building collapsed around them. Only 3 children survived. The next day, the sole surviving ship, the Farabe, set sail with a plea for help and news that at least 500 had been killed. This was a vast underestimate. The city was overwhelmed with the dead, only made worse when already buried corpses were washed out of the cemetery. To prevent the spread of disease, men were conscripted at gunpoint to form dead gangs tasked with collecting the bodies, tying them together by their ankles, and loading them onto trucks. Unfortunately, there were too many to bury, so the first plan was to take the bodies out on ships and dump them at sea. But to the workers' horror, the currents just washed them back ashore. After that, the gangs were forced to use funeral pyres instead. They were lit wherever bodies were found and burned for several weeks. In total, 20% of the population, or between 8,000 and 12,000 people, lost their lives, making the Galveston hurricane not just the most deadly U.S. hurricane, but the most deadly natural disaster ever to hit the U.S., and bloodier than the rest of this list combined. Thankfully, we've learned from these tragedies of the past, and today it's rare for U.S. hurricanes to cause more than a few hundred immediate deaths. However, there's still a long ways to go. As our understanding of the long-term death toll grows, the statistics are clear. Those who have the least are still suffering the most and are more likely to die. But how can we fix this? And as hurricanes get stronger, can we be sure we've done enough to prevent another disaster like Galveston? Found yourself captivated by the human stories behind the statistics? Like, share, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, and we'll keep shedding light on more shadows of history.